Okay, last time we talked about what can be some of the qualities of consciousness or some of the features of consciousness that are apparent to a technique that philosophers, at least since the time of Descartes, have used, known as introspection. That is, just looking into your minds and seeing what you find there. And the introspective philosophical analyses of consciousness have given rise to discussions about three particular aspects of consciousness that we discussed a lot last time. Qualia, that is the distinctive quality of some kind of experience. Intentionality, the idea that conscious mental states are always about something other than themselves. And finally, subjectivity, the idea that consciousness is inherently observer-dependent. And the challenge for a scientific study of consciousness is to make a science out of it, to find a way to formulate a publicly observable set of facts about an inherently subjective and private set of experiences. And at the end of the hour, I turn to a particular case, synesthesia, to describe one of the ways in which we can do that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on synesthesia today, but that went a little fast last time. There's more on synesthesia in the lecture supplements if you're really interested. But remember, the primary definition of synesthesia is this is a perceptual experience where stimulation in one modality elicits sensation in another modality. So that there are people like this subject, subject C, who has what's known as digit color synesthesia, where the presentation of a digit, even a digit printed in black or black and white or grayscale or whatever, that digit is seen in color by this individual. And these are, in fact, the colors that are associated with those particular digits. And so one of the, how do we know? How do we know that subject C actually sees colors when he sees digits? Well, Ramachandran and Hubbard devised a couple of tasks to allow them to do that, one of which is this perceptual grouping task, where a synesthetic subject who saw digits in color and non-synesthetic subjects were presented with arrays like this and simply asked whether the numbers form horizontal rows or vertical columns. So, of course, you can see them either way, but the trick here is that 3s and 8s look alike, kind of, sort of, so that by virtue of the Gestalt principle of grouping by similarity, most people tend to see this array as consisting of sets of rows rather than sets of columns. Okay? But that's not the case. Going too fast. That's not the case for subject C, who sees some digits in red and other digits in blue. And so, again, according to the Gestalt principle of similarity by color, he is going to see these digits as arrayed in columns, grouped by color, rather than rows. So again, this is one way in which we can tell that this subject, at any rate, actually does see these things in color the way he says he does. Here is another example. I showed you this one last time, okay, where subjects are presented with an array and asked to find the 2 in an array of 5s. It takes subjects sometimes a while to do this because these 2s and these 5s look alike. It turns out that a synesthetic subject for whom 2 is a different color than 5 sees this pretty quickly. And also, synesthetic subjects are much more likely to see that the 2s in this array form a triangular pattern. There's the data on that. The synesthete was much more likely to see the array, to see the pattern than the non-synesthetic subjects. So using these kinds of behavioral techniques that yield publicly observable data, we hope to be able to confirm, if you will, what the subject says he or she is experiencing. Through the use of these kinds of laboratory methods developed in psychology, we hope to make a publicly observable science, a science of publicly observable facts about an experience that is inherently private and subjective. So now, why are you doing this to me? Okay, so now, having talked about subjectivity and intentionality and qualia and all of those good philosophical things, we're now in a position to reframe certain interesting questions about consciousness. Instead of asking, well, what's consciousness? Well, we know that. It's about qualia and intentionality and subjectivity. Or does my dog have consciousness? Or does my computer have consciousness? Or can there be unconscious mental states or whatever? We can use this philosophical vocabulary to reframe these kinds of questions. So now we don't want to ask whether you can have unconscious mental states. That's too broad a question. But we can say, well, can qualia, those intrinsic, ineffable, indescribable qualities of various kinds of experiences, can they be unconscious as well as conscious? Can intentional states be unconscious? Can you have a mental state that is about something other than itself, but still not be aware of it? Can you have consciousness without qualia? Are they really necessary for a state of consciousness? Can you have conscious states without intentionality? In Eastern meditative traditions, especially certain forms of Buddhism, the answer is yes. And in fact, the goal of certain forms of Buddhist meditation is to achieve pure consciousness, which isn't about anything other than itself. Can non-human animals have intentional states? Can they have states of consciousness that are about something other than themselves? Or can machines? And finally, can consciousness cause anything? Okay, does consciousness exist as a causal feature of the world that causes other kinds of things to happen? Again, with this vocabulary, we hope to be able to ask these questions a little bit more precisely. We're going to focus today on the problem of qualia and what certain kinds of experimental research has to say about qualia and how we can identify them. And the text for today's lecture really comes from the philosopher at NYU, Thomas Nagel, who wrote a famous paper entitled "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?", which is now a classic in the literature on consciousness, which begins basically by saying the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there's something it's like to be that organism. That is, there's some kind of experiential quality to that organism's or the organism's existence. Fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it's like to be that organism, something that it's like for that organism. So your dog has to have some idea about what it's like to be a dog. The problem of qualia is really the problem of what it's like, okay? What it's like to have various kinds of experiences. So what we want to do now is try to identify through psychological research what these basic qualities of conscious experience are. And this research, very long research tradition extending back into the 19th century, has focused mostly on the problem of sensation. First, the modalities of sensation. I asserted last time that there's something it's like to see something that's different from what it's like to hear something, okay? Well, let's try to figure out if that's true and what's responsible for that. And then various qualities within sensation. Within the modality of vision, there's something it's like to see red that's different from what it's like to see blue. Within the modality of gustation, there's something it's like to taste sweet as opposed to sour. And then the idea is that once we've identified what these basic qualia of experience are, then we can go on and try to establish things like their neural correlates. What is it about the brain and the rest of the nervous system that mediates these basic qualities, that gives rise to them, and so on? A problem that moves us from what's known as sensory psychophysics, basically trying to analyze sensory experience, to sensory neurophysiology. The fundamental answer to this question was given to us by Charles Sherrington in the early part of the 20th century, who, in a famous series of lectures, identified essentially 8 or 9, depending on exactly how you count, the different modalities of sensation, and he broke these up into various kinds of classes. First, there is what's known as exteroception, which is the sensation of events that occur outside the individual's body, somehow outside the individual's body. And then there's proprioception, which has to do with sensations of the individual's body itself. And then finally, there's what Sherrington called interoception, which has to do with sensation of events that are going on inside your body. Sherrington didn't pay too much attention to interoception because interoception generally doesn't give rise to conscious sensations. Interoception is things like blood pressure, cell fluid levels, things like that. You might feel hungry, you might feel stomach contractions or something, you might feel thirsty because your mouth is dry, but you don't really have direct introspective access to things like blood pressure. That's why they call blood pressure the silent killer, because you don't know when you've got high blood pressure. But all the rest of these, exteroception and proprioception, do give rise to various kinds of conscious sensations, and they themselves can be further subclassified. You've got what Sherrington called distant senses of vision and audition, where the stimulus really does lie outside the individual's body. Then you've got chemical senses like gustation and olfaction, where the stimulus for the sensation is some kind of chemical reaction. Something gets into your nose or gets into your mouth and you smell it or taste it. And then you've got skin senses, where something actually has to touch the surface of the skin. There's the tactile sense, there's the thermal sense, and then there's a very difficult sense called pain, all right, about which I've got more to say again in the lecture supplements. Proprioception comes in 2 kinds. There's kinesthesis, the sensation of motion. As I'm pacing back and forth in front of you, I'm experiencing feedback from my arms and legs that tells me where they are in space. And also equilibrium. As I move back and forth, I get sensations that tell me whether I'm upright, at an angle, lying down, or whatever. Those are the classic categories of the various modalities of sensation. There's something it's like, Sherrington argued, to see something that's different from what it's like to hear something, and so on. Okay, so how do we know? How do we define this? Well, Sherrington and others basically defined each modality of sensation in a couple of different ways. They tried to get beyond just what it's like and people's intuitions that it's different hearing something than it is seeing something, as obvious as that might be. And Sherrington and other investigators tried to identify the distinctive features associated with each of these sensory modalities. And they basically came up with a package of 4 features. First, each of the modalities has a particular proximal stimulus, some pattern of energy that radiates from the stimulus and falls on the sensory receptors or the sensory surfaces of the body. So, for example, in the case of